Alicia actually sent me a quote to start on, so we'll
Yeah.
start on that because we are going to be talking about the Black Lives Matter movement as well as talking about anti-blackness and racism in the South Asian community mainly, but also with regards to ex-Muslims and Muslims.
Yeah.
But the quote is, "Why at the marches, at the Women's March, there's no machine guns? Why at Pride marches there's no machine guns, but the Black Lives Matter march, machine guns everywhere? I don't know. You tell me." And this is from Ellen Pompeo.
Oh, she's an actress on Grey's Anatomy.
We agreed to do a video today surrounding this issue because it's been, although it shouldn't be as contentious as it is, it's been quite contentious within our own community, and I wanted to talk about it with you because we're kind of on the same we're on the same wavelength about where we stand on the matter. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, like, I've never really been tied to one form of activism, because before I was ex-Muslim, I did care about these issues. Before I was out doing any sort of this stuff, I did focus on, like, race and racial representation. In my degree, I did my undergraduate dissertation on institutional racism within Hollywood and television and film. So, like, that's something I've always been interested in anyway, regardless of, and it's what I've talked about. I've done, like, threads of it on Twitter when I was doing my research for that. And I've talked to my friends about it while I was studying together, and we would talk about all this sort of stuff anyway. My frustration came out when, again, I was shy of stuff anyway. I didn't really think about what other people were doing, because pretty much everywhere on my social media somebody was talking about, yes, it was quieter at times, because I don't think not everyone inherently uses social media politically, but even those that didn't use social media politically then slowly began to speak out and share things and whatever. And then it wasn't until, like, so another ex-Muslim, not really aligned with the movement as a whole, she sort of approaches things from a feminist standpoint anyway. She still talk about racism, feminist issues with it related to religion, whatever, but she talks it from that standpoint. And she was frustrated about why the ex-Muslim community hadn't said anything, considering, you know, we're quite active on social media and we talk about all sorts of issues. And, like, I had a conversation with her privately, and again, it got to her more because she said, like, her second mom is black, some of her closest friends aren't. She's seeing, like, the direct effects of this, and, like, being ex-Muslims still continue to do what they're doing, focusing on, like, Islam and criticizing it or whatever, which is fine. There was no issue doing that, but they couldn't talk about sort of Black Lives Matter and what was going on, considering a lot of these people, we all sort of use, it's kind of interchangeably used the term as a human rights activist or activist in general, and that should include the rights of all. And that then I didn't really think about it in that way, because I was just focusing on the movement of Black Lives Matter and amplifying voices, sharing petitions, whatever. That's what I was focusing on until it was brought to my attention. And then being like, even, it's not just with the ex-Muslim community, it was some Muslims saying, or like Muslim sheikhs being like, oh, protests are haram, but they weren't saying it when, say, Palestine was protesting, etc., or whatever. And there are Muslims that are calling that out. And we should be able to care about multiple issues at once and talk about multiple issues at once. Again, there are black ex-Muslims, and there have been black ex-Muslims who have shared that they felt alienated by this.
Yeah, I think the sort of rhetoric that I've seen around our own community, around the ex-Muslim community, we've only had two. Again, like, I don't want to name names, but we've had two major ex-Muslims. Yeah,
they're the longest life dedicated to the movement, I guess.
Yeah, they're prominent in the movement, and they seem to be the only two people who have been actively speaking in support of Black Lives Matter, which is surprising to me, because as a persecuted minority, you would think that we would support other persecuted minorities. And I've just seen a lot of rhetoric that is very bias to, oh, we don't agree with the violence, when the violence is not the point of the movement.
I'm like, that, I get with that, and that was one of my biggest issues. I'm like, yes, okay, fair enough, we don't agree with any of the violence,
Yeah.
But then we can help in a positive way. There were numerous petitions that were
so
the ones that first started off with like
other forms of
murder charges higher, and all these other petitions reopen cases about black people who've been killed, but the police had done nothing. You could sign the petition. And to say that, and they have worked. Breonna Taylor's case is being reopened. George Floyd's the murder charges have been up to second-degree murder. So these things are working. In the UK, they've reopened Belly Majinga's case now after pressure from the protests and petitions as well.
Yes.
So it is working.
It is, and I think that they keep this very blinkered focus on the violence without actually addressing the other peaceful methods of protest that have been put out by the movement. These petitions, these, even these physical demonstrations.
Bail bonds to help people, all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, there is so much, and
on like a more
also
community level, it's like
also raising money and actively calling out all of the people who are part of the movement are actively calling out the violence as well, and to only focus on the violence is extremely blinkered, and I don't understand what's going on.
In the last few days, obviously there's been videos about the new Black Panther Party, and there's numerous people from within the Black Lives Matter movement have been calling this out. The original Black Panther Party members have called it out, saying we don't align with them because I think it's of anti-Semitism, I would say.
Yeah.
So they've been calling it out. I don't know, there's just this focus on the material aspect of things right now.
Yeah. And I think the other excuse, and it is an excuse that I've heard going around, is that, oh, well, the Black Lives Matter movement has never done anything for ex-Muslims, so why should we support them? And I think that is extremely selfish. I think that when you're an activist and you believe in something, you cannot be an activist, or in my opinion anyway, based on what I believe, you can't do activism on a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours basis. It's not a tit for tat basis. When we talk about...
We would get nowhere, and I think because it's so... Again, I don't know, this is just our approach. Like, if you put one foot forward and the people in your immediate circle you're following sees you've done this for one movement, when our movement is in need, or we share something, we will get that help, and that
my main problem with that rhetoric is, and again, I'm not going to name names, but to give an example that may, kind of sway the person who made this argument, we support gay Muslims. I actively support gay Muslims, and I will always support them. But it's no secret that gay Muslims are more than willing to throw ex-Muslims under the bus at some times, if it means that they'll get into the good books of Muslims, or slightly more extremist scholars, which they don't support gay rights in the slightest. Just because they have this opinion of us does not mean we stop doing the right thing. And just because even if you don't agree with the movement, if you don't agree with Black Lives Matter, why would you be making excuses for your opinion instead of just stating it?
Yeah.
It's extremely cowardly.
Again, with the whole gay Muslim point, again, there will be some that will throw us under the bus, but there are so many that I've come in contact with, especially on social media, who have supported ex-Muslims. Like, I'm going to say her name because she knows I talk about it all the time, but Sarah, like, when we had that whole self-set and we were getting so much abuse, she spoke up for us, and she does routinely do that anyway. Yeah. And there is positive dialogue happening now. I'm not saying it's predominant, but it is there, and we do have that support, and we just have to work with that support. Yeah.
I agree. And I just think that also being very selfish about your activism is inherently bigoted. I'm not going to throw out any other more pointed labels. Like, I'm not going to call anybody a racist or a white supremacist, because I think that those terms are already watered down and I don't need to do that. Yeah. But I think that if you are selectively, picking human rights battles, that really speaks to what you value and what you don't value.
Mariana was saying, I'm not saying the same, but it's like he's claims to humanism, but it becomes almost selective humanism, so it's like selective activism in a sense.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to label anybody, and I'm being very careful about this, as I always am, but I get in trouble anyway, so I don't even know why I bother. You know, if you are gonna be a humanist in terms for your own gain, and that's fair enough if that's what you do, if you're gonna do that, you can't call yourself a human rights activist if you won't fight for black people's rights. There is clearly a distinction in the way in that these people are being treated. Police brutality and the power dynamic that exists there is clearly being exploited, because this is not the first time this has happened, and this is not the first time that people have protested about it, in not just in the US but also in the UK. It is clearly a problem, and is no longer just a political issue, it is a human rights issue, and there is something that needs to be done. I'm not saying that there aren't nuances and deeper and finer points to this movement that can be discussed, such as statistics and things like that. But what I am saying is that when you selectively ignore a human rights issue while calling yourself an activist for that, for that thing, it's really, really gross when you suddenly turn around and you say, well, they've never done anything for me, so why should I do anything? They're so willing to throw us under the bus. People
saying, it's not that bad here. Just because it's not as bad in the UK doesn't mean it's an issue. I mean, if you look at the recent case with that Sally Munjinga, her case was closed pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yet they're still looking for Madeleine McCann, and that's come up in the news again.
Yeah.
So now they've reopened her case. Similar things with the young girl Shukri Abdi, who was killed. Still not looked into her.
Yeah.
They're ruling it as she drowned, but she had bite marks. And there was more like, I saw a recent thread where there's a history of bullying in that school among teaching staff, and one member of staff did end up taking her own life. So there are issues there, and that needs to be looked at a lot more.
Yeah, I agree.
And even in like the UK, so we, since 2015, they've still been paying slave owners for loss of property in the sum of £20 million. It's now £300 million today, so it's transferable as well from taxpayers to slave owners, the huge debts that they incurred had slavery not having the abolition of slavery was only paid off in 2015.
I mean, the UK did play a massive part in the in the slave trade triangle, so that doesn't surprise me, but it is upsetting to hear. And I think the other thing is, as you and some others know, I actually attended the protest that happened in the UK yesterday, and myself and Vicky actually did leave before things turned as violent as they did, because Vicky had a train to catch back home, and I was kind of tasked with chaperoning her, only slightly. I don't want to she's younger than me, but she is an adult, so I don't want to demean her in any way. But her mother was significantly worried about her attending the protest because she was afraid of violence and things breaking out, so we did end up leaving early just so she could catch her train. And I think a lot of people have DM'd me and messaged me asking me about my choice to go and join the protest, and whether or not I was concerned about COVID, and this is not a UK issue. I just want to clarify that just because, first of all, even if I were to agree to disagree and say that this isn't a UK issue, that does not mean that we shouldn't protest. When injustices happen around the world, we protest everywhere, and that is how we make a change. That is how we make them hear you. You can't just assign problems to specific areas. When we talk about the abuses in China against Muslims, everybody needs to talk about it. Everybody needs to protest it. When we talk about, I have no opinion on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's too complicated for me to delve into. But if we look at the kinds of protests that go on around that, people around the world protest. And I think that, to say that, oh, this is not a UK issue and we shouldn't be protesting it, is really not helpful. In terms of COVID and my concerns about COVID, there is no one in my household that can be affected by it. We've all got our antibodies, and I'm pretty sure I've already had COVID, even though I haven't been tested. And, the only person that I'm putting at risk is myself, and I think I'm entitled to do that. I obviously can't speak for everyone who joined me in the protest. I can't speak for everybody. My friend Vicky, she's already had COVID. She's been tested. She's also, she works in Tesco, so she's always outside anyway.
She's just at risk from going to work anyway.
Yeah. And, we had our face covers. We couldn't really maintain social distancing. If anybody's going to, throw a fit about that, please feel free to. I'm more than welcome to have that argument in the comments later on. But I felt like I needed to do my part. I think that this movement is very, very important. And I think that the fact that people are prioritizing their own businesses and their own health over the fact that people are being killed by police officers in the middle of a pandemic, I don't think that you have the right to tell us that COVID-19 is dangerous when people in power are taking advantage of us and killing us.
These people that have been killed, they've been killed for the most mundane of things. They've been killed for going out, for driving, for jogging, for sleeping, for yelling, for babysitting, for eating ice cream in their garden. They've been killed for such little things.
I would argue that George Floyd was actually killed for pleasure. None of the things that happened in that footage, and I've watched it several times to my own dismay because I am just such a glutton for punishment. I've watched it several times, and nothing that George Floyd did in that footage of him being killed warranted that level of restraint and pressure on both his body and on his neck. And I think it's disgusting that quite a few people within our own community are saying, are we going to ignore the fact that George Floyd was a criminal?
Because in the image you tend to be cropped, it's just the white police officer with his neck on George Floyd.
Yeah.
But there was also an Asian police officer there.
Yes.
He turned away. He was just as complicit. The person who called the police on George Floyd was someone working in an Arab American-owned store.
Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of the time, also, that when we talk about this, a lot of people are like, oh, you're just anti-white, you're just an anti-white racist, you know, and all of that. And I'm not going to sit here and deny that that doesn't exist. It clearly does. I don't think it's worth talking about right now because it's not the issue. But I'm not going to deny it exists. I understand that it exists. But my part in the movement, and I want to make this very clear, and I feel like I have, but for some reason people aren't getting it, I do not like that police in the States, in the UK, and in other places in the world are using the power that is given to them to protect people and abusing it in a way to demean and kill people. And that is what I am fighting against. And I do think that there is a certain level of a power dynamic that exists there, and it needs to be sorted. The man who killed George Floyd, I will not be calling him by his name, the man who killed him had 3 counts of police brutality already, another incident that ended in the death of a civilian, and he was still a police officer. You know, and the Asian man who was involved in that incident with George Floyd, he also had that in his record where he had been involved in police brutality before. Well, I think that there is a discussion that needs to be had about a zero tolerance policy for brutality. Like, why are those people still allowed to be police officers? And why are we ignoring that and making excuses for them? I mean, I'm not going to talk about the worst take of the century because I really don't think it needs to be talked about. I think we've talked it to dirt already on Twitter, and again, no names, no assumptions. It was the worst take in history, and we're not going to talk about it. But that's why I wanted to bring you on, because I feel like we have a lot of frustrations, and I think a lot of people like to dismiss the fact that we have frustrations and that emotions shouldn't be taken into account. There are a lot of emotions entangled here, because it is about the killing of a man, and it was broadcast everywhere, you know. And we saw him die, and I think that it's necessary to get those frustrations out of the way. I do want to ask you that another argument that I heard a lot of, and we will delve into, I think I might split this recording up into parts so that we have like specific topics that we talk about, also because I don't really want to make videos on other topics until something happens about this. Another excuse that I've heard is that, you know, all of the Black Lives Matter stories are purely anecdotal and they sort of don't stand up to the statistics that exist that police officers have. What would you say to that?
Well, you know, you talk about the anecdotal aspect. Well, we encourage ex-Muslims to share their stories of what happened to them and their abuse or anything like that. We encourage them to share it, but there are no statistics. There's lack of, for certain reasons, people aren't studying it. It's not safe for people to talk about it. A lot of anonymous information on Twitter, yet we still think that's fine. So why is it almost?
I think that it's pretty disgraceful, actually, that ex-Muslims would make this claim that, oh, you know, it's BLM could just be a bunch of liars, and that, you know, they're not talking, it's not statistically accurate, so therefore we can dismiss it. Our entire movement is based on stories.
Yeah.
Our entire movement is based on the fact that a certain level of abuse has been handed to us, and we share our stories, and we recover from our experiences by sharing and, you know, taking in these stories and understanding that we are not alone. To dismiss an entire movement because of anecdotes, I think, is a little ridiculous. And also, what I want to say, that not all police brutality ends in death, and not all police brutality is televised to this extent. When someone shares their story, it's very similar to...
Lucky that there was a girl there videoing it. There'll be cases that all have been lost because no one was there to see it.
Yeah.
And then the only people speaking up about it will be direct relatives or friends.
Yeah, or people who actually saw it happen. And then even then, if it wasn't filmed, it would be their word against the words of government workers. It would be their words against police officers.
You have an extreme privilege that we know that, like, that police officer knew he was getting away with it. He could see he was being recorded, and he knew, like, he was going to get away with it. But because of these protests that have gone out, I think because, again, it's been in a pandemic and people have really just been like, we can't handle this anymore, that he will have to go down for it, because if he doesn't, it will just be...
But the thing is that he's not going down because the thing is, he's not going down because the system believes that he deserves to. He's going down because of public outrage. And I find that despicable, that a man murdered somebody publicly. A man murdered somebody, and he was originally going to be tried for manslaughter. And when you hear about this and when people talk about this, I am still so blown away by the fact that people are so dismissive of the fact that a man was murdered. And they'll treat this protest as if it's just people being bored, and they just want to create disorder, and they just want to loot and be thieves. And I think it really, really does come from a very bigoted place. That's not to say that you can't talk about that. I'm not saying that you can't say that, you know, I don't like the fact that people are looting shops and burning buildings. That's not what I'm saying.
When you're only talking about that, that becomes an issue in the narrative that you're constructing.
When you construct a narrative that is solely against the protests and against Black Lives Matter, even if you haven't said it, it's not difficult to understand what your motives are and the place that you're coming from. And you shouldn't need to, and this is something that I've said before, and again, I'm not going to name names, but you shouldn't need to be like, oh, well, you should have asked me what my motives were. If you are posting things publicly and you are constructing a narrative, it does not matter who your friends are, and it does not matter what you tell them. You are constructing a narrative for your audience very publicly, and you deserve to be called out publicly. I
think Hassan Minhaj makes a really good point in his video when he was just like, when he names like all the different ways that the reasons for why or how these black people have been killed. So it's like driving, jogging, sleeping, babysitting, all sort of basically just existing.
Yeah. He
says, you say that's a lawless country, so why are we shocked that people are asking for revolutionary change when we support overseas? We support the Arab Spring, we support Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm.
So why can't we support it in the US? Clearly, their legal system is not supporting them.
Mm-hmm.
The institutions are just attacking them. So they need revolutionary change.
Yeah, and might I add that the United States has a history of revolution. The United States only formed because of a revolution, and they have statements within their constitution that allows for revolution. That's why they have gun laws. For me, it doesn't make any sense why these arguments are being made. Like, there are clearly arguments that you can make that are grounded in some kind of, they're grounded in, you know, facts and statistics and things like that, and I appreciate those arguments. I think that is something that deserves to be talked about. But when you make dismissive arguments like, oh, they're just stories, or oh, they haven't done anything for us, therefore why should we do anything about this, or get a statement from a Black Lives Matter protester about ex-Muslims and then we can talk, I think it's extremely gross and selfish, and I don't like it. But I think we've dealt with the frustration side of it. I was talking to your wife, Sarah, and
Sarah, yeah.
I was telling her that I had constructed I dabbled in like writing comedy, like I wanted to do comedy before I realized that I can't really read a script and be funny at the same time. But I did write a sketch that's about an hour long, and there's a part of this sketch that I do about racism within the Muslim/ex-Muslim community, and I didn't know if I wanted to read it or not, but she said that she would love to see me do that. I'm gonna tank because I don't know how to read from a script, but I'm gonna try it anyway.